Ahoy! Little last minute addition to this video. Delacron announced that they have a client performance improvement change coming in the next bug fix patch, so likely very soon. They say while it likely won't address all sorts of problems, this should improve everyone's experience regardless. Scale of improvement drastically depends on your local hardware setup. More details to be included in the patch notes. These are some great news and also explain why they didn't talk about this on the previous Q&A, because I guess they were just very close to finishing it but didn't want to promise anything in case they can't deliver. But let's see how well this patch actually plays out in that regard. And now back to the original video. Today we get a new episode of my favorite show, The Balance of Power, and with that we also got some hint to some upcoming potential changes for Season 3. Also there is an important new bug that you might want to know of, so let's begin. The first thing that David discussed was balance in different modes. When it comes to OPR, he had some good news and some bad news. The good news were that weapon balance has a very even distribution of weapons used, with the win rates also being very close to each other for the weapons. So it's within 1.1% from the best to the worst weapon. Very, very close. The damage is also good. There's a bit of an advantage for ranged players in terms of damage, but the kill distribution looks good. This is not really that surprising when you think about it. A ranged player just has way more options to consistently deal damage without having to be close to the enemy, whereas a melee player needs to get close first, and when the melee player gets close, they typically have more kill potential. The bad news for OPR balance is that the distribution of quality matches is wider than they want, meaning the matchmaking isn't that great. As they already said in the Fortune Eternum episode, they are going to be working on a matchmaking system, but it will take them a while to get it out to players. When it comes to arena balance, they think there is pretty good weapon balance here, though some aren't used as much. The musket isn't used as much. They think it's mainly because it simply doesn't have the same benefits when there's not enough range to utilize it, because enemies are close to you very quickly. I would think there's more to that than just that, because we used to see muskets in arena, but that was also at a point where muskets were very overtuned, so difficult middle ground here. It more so comes down to the musket maybe just not having the tools yet to be as effective at closer range until they do the musket rework. The Void Gauntlet is also not used as much, and I think this is actually fairly easy to explain. In Arena you need to be relatively self-sufficient, so just using the Void Gauntlet as a debuffer isn't that effective. So what was typically the case for Arena is that people used it in a Void Blade build. Void Blade builds aren't particularly effective at the moment because there are once again some issues with the attacks, and the grid perk with a 300 con, if you're even using that in Arena, doesn't work nearly as well as it would sound like, because the frames that you get in terms of grid are really short on the Void Blade. Thanks to Jason for showing me that. So that's actually way less effective than any other weapon that gets grid from 300 con, and I believe that's a big factor in why it's just not used as much. The Blunderbuss is also not used as much, but it's doing pretty well. I think that always comes down to the Blunderbuss just being fairly difficult to be played effectively, so with that high skill floor, it's just less appealing for a lot of players. The performance may also be affected by certain macros, we'll get to that later. The weapon win rates are distributed pretty well across most weapons in Arena, with 2 builds performing higher than they want. One of the builds is Fire Staff plus Ice Gauntlet, and the other one is Sword and Shield plus Spear. They've got eyes on both, and the SNS and Spear is seeing some specific nerfs here, but the Fire Staff, especially the Ice Gauntlet, not really to the same degree. Once again, I think one of the major balance issues with the Ice Gauntlet in particular is how much lingers while you switch to another weapon, how little you actually need to use the Ice Gauntlet, and this is especially true for Ice Pylon, which is also a secondary defense at the same time because it can be used to block other attacks. So last patch there was a Hail and Hardy bug, with some people still having Hail and Hardy from the town buff, plus the new increased health. Those people apparently thought that the time to kill felt better, because it kind of reduced the burstiness a little bit. I will say this is somewhat ironic, because these people were not necessarily playing against players that had the same buffs. So sure, for them burstiness was reduced, but they were maybe still doing the same damage to others that didn't have that extra health. So I feel like there would be some bias introduced here. But anyways, what they're trying to do now is adjusting the health scaling. So they want to do HP adjustments in the season, likely with con providing more HP early on. So your first points invested into con would provide you with more health compared to later, which I don't quite know how that's gonna play out, because I feel like that inherently ends up nerfing the ones that invest more into con. but it is definitely an interesting approach. David said this is going to be in Season 2, but I'm not sure if he misspoke there, if he meant that is in a balance patch that is in this season, or if he actually meant Season 3. Either way, this is something that is coming. There's also a very important stat swap between the 150 and 300 dex perk. So the reduced stamina cost for dodging is one of the strongest attribute threshold bonuses in the game, according to David. They want players to have to invest to get to that, so they are switching the 150 dex perk to be the 300 dex perk, and then the 300 perk is the 150 perk. This comes with some issues in my opinion. I completely agree that the perk was way too strong for 150 dex, because I think it's a very, very useful perk, and especially for medium players that just get a ridiculous amount of dodges. The problem is who this build remains available to. If you're using a mixed build with greatsword, sword and shield, spear, you're usually not running 300 dex. You're usually running less than that because you're melee, you want to have some con, you also need usually a mix of strength and dex to get at least half decent scaling out of your damage, so you're not really going there. The only people that will consistently go there are people who can afford to not invest into a secondary damaging attribute or can afford to not invest into con. In other words, bows and muskets. Those builds already have relatively high safety just based on the fact that you can sit far away and deal damage before the enemy even closes distance to you. So far, mixed dex melee builds were a reasonable counter to them because they were able to kind of close the distance reasonably without losing too much stamina in the process. Now, less so. So I don't see how this would not lead to balance issues in the long run. I would have rather seen them remove the stamina reduction dex perk entirely so that everyone ends up on an even ground here. In that case, if you want extra stamina cost reduction or stamina regain, then you'd have to do so through different weapon perks. But all of this may not end up being super relevant because it is possible that through the con changes that they were talking about, we may be able to run less con in general, and then obviously more aggressive builds would be possible that can invest heavily into dex. And also, there's something else coming to attributes that we'll talk about in a bit that could affect this as well and make it matter a lot less. But first, another change they want to do is they don't want fortified buffs to count towards Invigorated Punishment, so they're looking to change that soon. This is very interesting because Invigorated Punishment already got nerfed in what it actually affects, or rather fixed in that regard. And this is another factor that makes it less of an issue if you want to run shirking, but also means that Invigorated Punishment in general will just get way less amplification. A lot of the buffs that currently count towards it are fortifies. There aren't that many other buffs that actually count towards it. There are some empowers from weapons that may count, some other effects, but really you're going to see less overall value coming out of Invigorated Punishment if fortifies are also not affected. Next, David discussed some specific weapons. Sword and Shield is slightly overperforming, especially at high level PvP. It has a gap closer, stun, good damage and stickiness at the moment. So what they're aiming to do here is changing Achilles Heel, the effect that gives you a slow on the last hit on your light attack chain, to instead provide a rend. This would also nerf the Opportunist passive further, which already has been nerfed recently, because you're no longer applying a slow that you can increase your own damage from abilities with. You still get a slow from Leaping Strike, but that one isn't particularly long, and you'd also still get a slow from Shield Rush if you're using that. So you'd still have multiple abilities that can apply Opportunist, but then at the same time it only increases ability damage, so at that point you're only really increasing the damage of one ability, so Opportunist really wouldn't get that much overall value anymore. And that would be a nerf to SNS insofar as well that you don't really have enough points to spend on damage in the SNS trees. You are going into defensive points at some point because there's just nothing else left. So if Opportunist also loses a lot of its value, then there's one less point to overall invest into damage. Rends in PvP are also not as strong as they used to be, so overall I think this would be quite a fair bit of a nerf. Along with that, they're also aware that the concussive bash upgrade from Shield Bash is currently not affected by Freedom. I think this is a tricky bug with the code that is in a dangerous closed path, so they can't modify that at the moment in the monthly patch, but will likely do so in Season 3. I can see where he's coming from here because this doesn't just affect concussive bash, it affects a variety of CC upgrades. The Spear is very popular with Sword and Shield at the moment, no surprise there honestly, because it just synergizes very well and makes a lot of sense, but it's also used with dex builds with the bow. It has been buffed quite a couple of times throughout the last seasons and people are now catching on basically. And David thinks that Cyclone is a bit too strong. I agree with that. It has AoE damage, it has grid, it has good damage, and it has a huge slow. So what they're going to do for the balance patch is they're going to nerf the slow from 50 to 30%. And for leeching Cyclone specifically, they're going to limit the number of targets to leech from in one activation. I think this is probably not going to be massive. It's probably going to affect 2 or 3 targets, which usually is going to be as many targets as you hit, except for PvE situations. But I don't think that's where it's the biggest problem anyway. So yeah, there will be outlier situations where this would heal you to full basically. But overall, I don't think this is going to be a major problem in more realistic, frequent situations. The Fire Staff has a slightly elevated win rate in Arena, but not in OPR. It has a little more damage than other weapons, but the kills aren't out of distribution. Again, I think this comes down to it giving you an option to deal damage safely while the enemy is still approaching you. The devs think it's overall in an okay place, but they keep an eye especially on the damage over time, which you can very passively apply. So they have no changes planned for the monthly patch so far. We might see something in the future. The bow is in a better place than the Fire Staff. David says that really good bow players make the bow seem like it's broken, but that's not the case for the majority of the player base. They are, however, aware of the gem bug where the elemental damage fall off is not applied. They can't fix that in the monthly patch, so this is a Season 3 fix. The Blunderbuss, and here we are maybe coming back a bit to the previous statistics, has certain combos that quote-unquote experts are pulling off, so probably macros. Those will be fixed in the monthly patch. When it comes to the hard runes, the eyes are once again on Detonate. David doesn't like the spikiness in damage that Detonate currently has, where certain setups allow it to proc for a lot of damage by combining empowers, crit damage, crit bonus, and so on. They are eliminating the ability for Detonate to crit entirely, which should be a good starting point for the balance changes to it. Apparently, Detonate bypasses all resilient when it crits, so I guess this is one way to solve that by just not making it crit in the first place. I also believe that there is another major factor that they didn't really go in depth here with Detonate specifically, which is that it doesn't sheath your weapon, whereas almost every other hard rune does. I think the only other exception is Stoneform. This means you're getting empowers that are from your weapon and they affect Detonate, while this is not the case for any other hard rune. Like, you don't get that with Cannon Blast. I think this is very confusing, very misleading, because it makes it seem like other hard runes are similar in damage if you just look at the tooltips, but then in reality Detonate does way more damage because it's affected by so many more empowers. Obviously, Detonate as a sheath would be awkward because you wouldn't be able to use your weapons for 3 seconds, but I believe they should simply make it not be affected by any empowers outside of the empowers that are on Detonate itself, so it is effectively treated like the hard runes that force you to sheath your weapons. And just to be safe, they should probably do the same for Brutal Stoneform. Somebody asked if they had plans to adjust underwhelming attribute breakpoint perks in Season 3, so attribute capstones I call them. Specifically mana management incentives for int and block incentives for con. Attribute capstones will see major reworks. They will move things around. For example, the dex change was originally planned for Season 3, and some weak bonuses will be removed and replaced with new ones. But they also said that there will be a new level of attribute bonuses and another way to dip your toes in, quote-unquote. I don't know what the second part is referring to, if you can like somehow get other attributes from other perks or something. Maybe you can get like an int perk without actually running int. Maybe that's the dip your toes part. But the new level of attribute bonus perks, very, very interesting. To me, this sounds like 350 attribute perks are coming. What this means for how many attribute points we'll have overall is unclear, but obviously very interesting because, again, something like the 300 dex perk is a lot more achievable if you have a lot of extra attribute points to spend. With the gear score changes, it does make sense we would have more attribute points because the max gear score will likely be higher in some form, and then you would be able to access that. If this means more than that, we can't really say at this point. This could, for example, technically mean that we get a level increase, but it doesn't have to. We had 500 to 600 gear score where you get more attribute points, and 600 to 625, all without a level increase. That's all on level 60. So yeah, I've seen some speculation about that. I don't know. It's possible, but I don't think we have any indication from this alone. Another question was if there will be further balance passes on Fortify, since there's a lack of consistency. Fortifying Sacred Ground and Shirking Fortification were named as some examples of things that could use some tuning. David says there are definitely still inconsistencies. He also saw someone post a really nice spreadsheet, so they are aware of that. They're looking into this, but it's likely not going to be in the monthly balance patch. They don't think there are any really game-breaking issues with this, so it's not like this super highest prio, but they will definitely do a consistency pass on it, mostly buffing existing Fortifys that didn't get adjusted enough. The community question was, what is the bug that bugs you the most that you see in combat? But speaking of bugs, there is another bug that we should talk about. I'd like to thank Minimoon for making me aware of this. This was posted by Yeshu. What's happening here is that when you buy the new XP chests from the faction vendors for different trade skills, that will actually cause inventory slots to be used up. With every cache that you buy, an extra inventory slot gets used up, but you can't see or remove these caches because they're already used. Amazon is aware and they've already responded to the thread, but I just wanted to let you know, maybe don't buy these for now. In better news, I found a more suitable format for the Sandworm guide, so this should actually be coming out soon now. Consider subscribing and clicking the bell if you'd like to see that. If you'd like to support me further and get early trading tips, then you can do so on Patreon. Thanks to my patrons who already do exactly that, and thank you for watching. Sloth, out.